Hey everyone and welcome back. Tonight we're diving into a gently twisted retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, full of cozy forests, slightly misguided wolves, and enough quiet absurdity to drift off with a smile. But before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more, and leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear what part of the story you're most excited to relax into tonight. Now, let's settle in, get comfortable, and let's wander into the woods. If one were to stroll through the village of Vernham Hollow on a mild spring morning, and one could if one were particularly bored or lost, one might describe it as pleasant in the way that slightly damp bread is pleasant. It was neither prosperous nor destitute, but rested comfortably in that middle ground where ambition goes to take a nap. The roofs were thatched, the windows small, and the streets unpaved but well trodden, as if the villagers had collectively agreed that progress was overrated. There was the faint, ever-present smell of bread, a comforting perfume that managed to hide the less charming undertones of livestock, river mud, and whatever was fermenting behind the butchers. In this village lived a girl called Red. Not Little Red exactly, the adjective had been added by enthusiastic gossip over the years, but just Red, as she was known to her neighbors, and to anyone who'd ever seen her walk past in that same bright cloak she wore with a kind of moral conviction. It was, admittedly, rather red, but she herself was not particularly small. She was in fact about average height for her age, with the slightly hunched posture of someone who'd been carrying too many baskets since she could remember. Her hair was brown, her eyes the color of unpolished wood, and her expression perpetually hovered somewhere between mild irritation and reluctant curiosity, the facial equivalent of fine, I'll do it. She lived with her mother, a woman best described as efficient to a fault. Her love language, as everyone knew, was unsolicited errands, tasks nobody had asked for, but which she dispensed with missionary zeal. If there was bread to be baked, she baked it twice. If there was a rumor to be verified, she confirmed it with sources. And if there was a relative within walking distance who hadn't recently received unsolicited carbohydrates, well, that was a problem she would soon correct. It was on just such a morning that Red's mother decided her elderly mother, living at the far end of the forest, must be in desperate need of baked goods. She'll be starving, her mother said firmly, wrapping a loaf in cloth as though preparing it for burial. She wasn't starving last week, Red pointed out. That was last week, her mother replied, as though that explained everything. This is now, and that, it seemed, was that. Within moments, Red found herself with a basket containing a loaf of bread, a pat of butter, and a small bottle of wine that her mother assured her was medicinal. "Take this to your grandmother," said her mother, "and don't dawdle." Red, who had precisely zero desire to embark on a half-day trek through a forest rumored to contain wildlife with problematic boundaries, tried one last appeal. "Can't you send a delivery boy?" Her mother gave her a look that could have soured. Cream. "And have the neighbors think I'm too frail to manage a simple act of familial devotion?" Red opened her mouth, closed it again, and sighed. She had learned early that arguing with her mother was like playing chess against the wind. Technically possible, but largely humiliating. So she put on her cloak, tied the ribbon under her chin, and took up the basket. It was heavier than expected, which suggested her mother had slipped in an additional loaf. This was not uncommon. Her mother believed in redundancy. If one pastry could express affection, two would ensure it was never questioned. Red stood at the door for a long moment, staring out at the narrow lane that led from their cottage to the edge of the forest. The lane was muddy in places, cheerful in others, and populated by neighbors who waved without ever offering to help. Across the way, Mrs. Willoughby, the local herbalist and unofficial collector of secrets, gave Red a knowing smile. "Off to your grandmother's, are you? How did you... Your mother mentioned it to everyone before breakfast." Of course she had. Her mother never undertook anything quietly. The sun was climbing slowly through a patchy sky as Red set off, the air full of the faint buzz of bees and the occasional sound of a distant hammer. Someone repairing something that would inevitably break again. It was, objectively, a fine day for walking. The forest, however, loomed like an argument waiting to happen. From the village, it appeared as a mass of green, dense and dignified, with that quiet authority that only ancient trees possess, the sort that look as though they've seen things and found them disappointing. Red had been told since childhood to never stray from the path, a warning that sounded important until you realized there was only one path, and it was quite obvious. The instructions seemed less about navigation and more about behavior, a gentle reminder to stay in one's metaphorical lane. Still, the path itself began not far from her doorstep, winding into the shade of the forest like a polite invitation. That might end badly. Before stepping into it, Red glanced back at her cottage. Her mother stood in the doorway, hands on hips, radiating confidence in a plan that made very little sense. "Don't talk to strangers," she called. "I won't. And don't eat anything before you arrive." "I won't. And for heaven's sake, don't lose the wine as it's the good kind." Red gave a small wave and trudged forward, her shoes squelching faintly in the soft earth. The transition from village to forest was immediate and total, like walking through a curtain between two moods. The light shifted, dimmer and cooler, filtered through layers of leaves. The air smelled of moss, damp bark, and the kind of quiet that suggested long, thoughtful silences between the trees. Red felt the path narrow beneath her feet, the forest folding around her like an audience. Watching her entrance with mild disinterest, she wasn't afraid exactly. She'd been through these woods before, though never alone and never with such an obvious snack pack dangling from her arm. Her basket swung rhythmically at her side, the weight pulling slightly at her shoulder. The bottle of wine clinked, faintly against the loaf of bread, a small domestic symphony. The sound was almost comforting, though she couldn't help but notice how loud it seemed out here. Even the birds went quiet for a moment, as if judging her snack choices. The forest floor was soft underfoot, layers of fallen leaves, twigs, and occasional mushrooms that looked both inviting and deeply suspicious. Shafts of light cut through, the canopy above, illuminating drifting motes of dust that danced lazily in the air. It was beautiful. In that particular way nature often is when you don't have to sleep in it. She thought of her grandmother, who lived alone at the far end of these woods, in a small cottage that smelled perpetually of herbs and furniture polish. Her grandmother was practical, sharp-eyed and only slightly terrifying. "She'll probably tell me my cloak's too bright," Red muttered to herself, stepping over a root. "Or that I should have worn better shoes, or that I walk like a peasant." It wasn't that her grandmother was unkind, just profoundly unimpressed by almost everything. The path curved gently left, then right, and then, without much warning, dipped into a hollow where the trees grew thicker. The air felt cooler, the light more distant. Somewhere nearby, water trickled faintly, a stream winding its way between stones polished smooth by centuries of patience. Red paused to adjust her basket and glanced around. There was no one, of course, just trees, leaves, and the vague sense that every branch had its own opinion about her progress. She sighed both from effort and existential fatigue. "This," she said aloud, "is absurd." But the forest did not reply, which was either comforting or rude, depending on how one interpreted silence. Back in the village, if anyone had asked her mother why she'd sent her only child unaccompanied through wolf country, she would have smiled politely and said, "It builds character." This was the same justification she used for cold baths, unpaid favors, and whatever vegetables were in season. Character, in her view, was not something one was born with. It was something thrust upon you by people who didn't want to do their own errands. And Red, dutiful and weary, had plenty of it. She imagined what her mother was doing now, probably cleaning the table, reorganizing shelves, or casually mentioning to the neighbors how some children simply rise to responsibility. The thought did not comfort her. Still, she walked. The rhythm of her steps settled into something steady, almost meditative. There was something about the forest that invited contemplation, the way the wind whispered through branches, the way light flickered on bark like candlelight. She found her mind drifting to her grandmother's creaky rocking chair, to the loaf of bread, growing staler by the minute, to the faint possibility that she might at any moment be eaten by a wolf. That last thought she dismissed quickly, because she had things to do, and one couldn't very well accomplish errands while being digested. Besides, wolves were rare these days, according to the blacksmith. who claimed to have only heard of them, usually from people who also believed in elves. Still, Red walked a little faster. The forest wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was like being at a polite dinner party where the host hasn't quite decided if they like you. Every now and then a branch creaked overhead, or a rustle echoed somewhere unseen, and she would tell herself very calmly, "It's just the wind." And almost always it was. Almost. After about an hour, the path leveled out near a clearing where sunlight pooled like warm honey. She stopped there to rest, setting down her basket on a patch of grass that looked moderately uninhabited. The bread had stayed warm somehow, and the butter was still firm, a small miracle. She sat for a moment, breathing in the stillness, the sound of her own heart blending with the faint murmur of the forest. This, she thought, wasn't so bad. She could almost enjoy it, if not for the growing awareness that her mother would absolutely expect a full report upon return, and that naturally it would have to include some profound reflection about the value of family or the joy of fresh air. She would rather face wolves. As the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant scent of pine and damp soil, Red closed her eyes. She imagined her grandmother's house, the crooked chimney, the worn shutters, the ancient teapot that always whistled like it was giving up on life. There was something comforting about the thought. Though she couldn't help feeling this whole trip was more symbolic than necessary, her grandmother was perfectly capable of baking her own bread. In fact, she'd once told Red that relying on others for food was the first step toward tyranny. Red wasn't sure what that meant, but it had sounded important at the time. So why this errand? Why today? Why her? Perhaps her mother simply needed quiet, or perhaps, as her grandmother might say, every woman must walk through a forest eventually, preferably before supper, and so she did. When she rose again, stretching her legs and brushing crumbs from her cloak, the sun had climbed higher and the air felt warm against her cheeks. She picked up the basket, squared her shoulders, and started down the path once more, into a world that smelled faintly of bread, damp earth, and a touch of impending trouble, the kind of trouble that didn't announce itself with thunder or fanfare, but simply waited, polite, patient, and slightly hungry, somewhere among the trees. But for now, all was well. The forest hummed softly, the birds resumed their gossip, and the young woman in the red cloak walked on, blissfully unaware that her day was about to become a great deal more interesting. There are, broadly speaking, two kinds of travelers, those who prepare efficiently, and those who make preparing into an entire phase of life. Red, though she would never have called herself one, was firmly of the second variety. When her mother had first mentioned the trip to grandmother's house that morning, Red had imagined she'd be gone within the hour. She'd grab the basket, tie her cloak, and be on her way before the bread had finished cooling. Instead, 3 hours later, she was still standing in the kitchen, staring at the loaf as though it were a complex moral dilemma. "It's cooling. Unevenly," she muttered, poking it gently with a fingertip. "The top's fine, but the bottom feels unambitious." Her mother, moving briskly around the table with the energy of someone perpetually one step ahead of everyone else, didn't look up. "Bread doesn't have feelings, dear. Wrap it and go." "I'm just saying," Red continued, "if it's not properly cooled, it'll go soggy in the basket, and then grandmother will think we're the sort of people who deliver damp bread." Her mother stopped, hands on her hips. "We are the sort of people who deliver bread. Dampness is a matter of fate." It was not the most encouraging philosophy, but it was her mother's. The butter was next. There were 2 pats, one a day old, and the other freshly churned that morning. Red examined both, as though selecting jewelry. "The older one has more flavor," her mother said unhelpfully. "The newer one looks more presentable," Red countered. "But the older one, I don't know, it has character." Her mother's eyes flicked toward the door. "If you don't leave soon, the butter will melt, and you'll have to take it as a drink." Red sighed and picked the newer one, wrapping it carefully in linen like a priceless heirloom. The kitchen around them was small but bustling with purpose, wooden counters worn smooth by years of chopping, herbs hanging in crooked bunches from the rafters, and the steady ticking of the clock that had been threatening to stop for the better part of a decade. A faint sunlight filtered through the small window. catching on motes of flour that hung in the air like lazy snow. It was objectively a perfect scene, if you weren't in the middle of it, trying to decide which pair of shoes was most appropriate for wolf country. The shoes were the next ordeal. Her mother insisted on the sturdy pair, thick leather, slightly cracked, and heavy enough to double as a blunt weapon if necessary. Red preferred the lighter ones, which were infinitely more comfortable, but offered roughly the same protection as optimism. "They pinch," Red complained, trying on. "The sturdier pair." "They'll stretch," her mother replied without looking up. "They sound like furniture when I walk. Then people will hear you coming. That's safer." "Safer from what?" "Conversation," said her mother. That, Red had to admit, was not entirely unreasonable. By mid-morning, the kitchen table looked like the aftermath of a negotiation between pastry and paranoia. The loaf sat neatly wrapped, the butter packaged, and the small bottle of wine placed reverently beside them. A bottle her mother insisted was for grandmother's health, though everyone silently agreed it was more for her patience. No one ever questioned the wine. In Vernham Hollow, wine existed in that pleasant moral grey area between medicine and household necessity. Red picked it up and squinted through the glass. The deep red liquid caught the light, glowing faintly like something that could either heal or ruin a perfectly good afternoon. "Is this from the cellar?" she asked. "The good one," said her mother. "I was saving it for company, but your grandmother qualifies. She doesn't drink. Then she can display it and feel superior." Red couldn't argue with that logic. It was airtight, in the way only maternal reasoning could be. She added the bottle to the basket with care, nestling it beside the bread. The basket was already heavier than she liked, but she had the kind of mother who believed that a well-packed parcel was a moral statement. "Don't forget to bring a cloth for the top," her mother called, rummaging through drawers for something. Invisible to Red's eyes. "I already have one, then take another. It might rain." "It's not going to rain. It might think about raining." After a brief but pointed silence, Red added another cloth. Packing, in theory, should have been a simple affair, but Red approached the task with the solemnity of a knight preparing for an uncertain quest. She checked the basket once, then again, in case it had somehow reorganized itself while her back was turned, then a third time, just to confirm that the bread hadn't developed legs and wandered off. Her mother hovered nearby, offering advice that was only slightly less helpful than, "The clock's ticking. Don't forget a kerchief," she said. "The woods are dusty." "I'm wearing one." "Then take a spare. It's wind, not dust." Her mother frowned. "Wind carries dust. That's science." Red added a spare kerchief. She tied her cloak, untied it, adjusted it, and tied it again. The ribbon under her chin refused to sit evenly, which she took as a bad omen. By the time she finally stepped outside to test the weather, the sun had shifted, the neighbors had eaten lunch, and she was fairly sure the bread had entered a new stage of maturity. It was one of those days where everything felt slightly out of sync, the sort of morning that could stretch indefinitely if you let it. Outside, the village was alive with the soft hum of ordinary life, the clang of a hammer from the blacksmith shop, the distant bleating of sheep, the faint, unhurried gossip of women exchanging news disguised as concern. Mrs. Willoughby, the herbalist, was already standing at her gate pretending to prune something that didn't need pruning. "Still here?" she asked with a raised brow. "Just making sure I've packed everything. It's a forest, not a voyage to the Indies." "I like to be prepared," Mrs. Willoughby smiled. That particular smile of women who had been watching younger women over-prepare for centuries. "Well, do try to return before supper. The forest gets strange after dusk." "How strange?" "Oh, the usual. Shadows moving about. Eyes that blink when you're not looking. Possibly a wolf, though I haven't seen one myself since I was courting." Red nodded politely and decided not to pursue that last comment. She went back inside. The house smelled of bread, beeswax, and her mother's lavender soap. It was an oddly comforting combination. Domesticity and mild anxiety in equal measure. Her mother was at the hearth now, scraping something invisible from the table. "I've been thinking," Red began cautiously, "maybe I should go tomorrow. The air's heavier today. Probably storm weather." Her mother didn't even glance up. "You'll go today. Tomorrow you'll find another excuse, and by Thursday your grandmother will have baked her own bread and accused me of negligence." She Wouldn't, she would. She has opinions about air. Red exhaled through her nose, a soft surrender. Fine. Good girl. Her mother handed her the basket, now covered neatly with the second cloth, as if modesty applied to baked goods. For a moment, the two stood in silence, mother and daughter framed by the doorway, one radiating certainty, the other radiating reluctance. It wasn't that Red disliked her grandmother, she just disliked everything that involved effort before noon, and there was something about errands that always grew in complexity the longer you thought about them, a kind of domestic. Mission creep. Still, she hoisted the basket. If I'm not back by supper, I'll assume you stopped for tea, or I was eaten by wolves. Her mother shrugged. Then I'll assume the wolves needed a moral lesson. It was not an especially sentimental farewell, but it was theirs. Red made it as far as the gate before realizing she'd forgotten her cloak pin, a small brass brooch shaped like a leaf. It had no practical function but felt symbolically necessary, like a passport or a promise. She went back inside. Her mother didn't even turn around. On the table, under the onions. How did you know? I always know. When she emerged, again cloak properly secured, she caught sight of her reflection in the small window pane beside the door. She didn't look particularly heroic. Her hair refused to behave, her cloak hung slightly crooked, and there was already a smudge of flour on her cheek. But there was something steady in her eyes, that particular blend of weariness and resolve inherited from every woman who'd ever been sent to deliver something unnecessary to someone difficult. She adjusted the cloak one last time, picked up the basket, and stepped into the daylight. By then the sun was high, the air thick with the smell of warm earth and distant baking. The road to the forest stretched ahead, narrow, uneven, and already shimmering faintly with heat. If she'd left when her mother first suggested it, she might have been halfway there by now. Instead, she stood at the edge of the path, considering the timing, the weather, and the complex logistics of motivation. She turned once more toward the house. Her mother was framed in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel. She gave a brisk nod, the universal gesture of "I told you so, now go." Red nodded back, a silent acknowledgement that resistance was futile. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on the basket, and finally began to walk. The road curved gently toward the forest, the trees ahead standing in quiet expectation. Behind her, the door closed with the soft, confident finality of someone who had already started cleaning up. And just like that, after half a morning of deliberation, debate, and domestic diplomacy, Red Riding Hood officially departed. Long after any reasonable person would have arrived, unpacked, and possibly written home about it. The forest began precisely where Red's patience ended. She'd stood at the edge of the path for several long, uncertain seconds, trying to decide whether the trees looked friendly or merely judgmental. They did not, she decided, look welcoming. They looked like the sort of trees that would hold a grudge, perhaps not against her personally, but against humanity in general, for centuries of what could only be described as axe-related misunderstandings. Still, she stepped forward, her boots crunching against a layer of leaves that had been artfully strewn about by autumn, as though nature were trying too hard to appear casual. The path wound forward, thin and dappled, sunlight dripping through branches like gold syrup. If she'd been a poet, she might have written about it, but Red was not a poet. She was, at best, a reluctant courier of carbohydrates. The forest had that quiet, dignified hush of places that think very highly of themselves. Each tree seemed to stand at attention, humming with mild disapproval. The oaks loomed grandly, the pines whispered conspiratorially, and the birches looked perpetually surprised to have been invited at all. Somewhere above, a bird chirped with the air of someone trying to be helpful, but not really succeeding. Another bird responded, clearly disagreeing. It was, Red realized, a small avian argument about absolutely nothing, nature's version of talk radio. She adjusted the basket on her arm. It was heavier than she remembered, though perhaps that was simply the weight of moral responsibility. The bread and butter clinked faintly against the bottle of wine, which was still pretending to be for medicinal purposes. The air smelled faintly of moss and mystery, and possibly mushrooms. The edible or existential kind, she wasn't sure. She walked slowly, because walking quickly felt like tempting fate, and besides, the forest had that way of stretching distances. Each turn in the path looked promising, like perhaps the next bend would reveal a charming clearing or a polite squirrel offering tea. Instead, it revealed more trees, all apparently part of the same leafy union and equally uninterested in her journey. There was, however, an undeniable sense of being observed, not in a sinister way, more like being silently judged by something large and furry. Red tried not to think about it too much. After all, she reasoned, she was a rational person, and rational people didn't invent woodland audiences. Still, she could have sworn she heard a rustle to her left. A faint exhale of breath that wasn't entirely wind. It was probably just the forest sighing, she thought. Nature seemed the sort to sigh often. As the path deepened, so did her thoughts. The woods had that effect, the kind of endless quiet that made one's mind wander off without permission. She thought about the strangeness of human travel, how every journey, no matter how noble in intention, eventually turned into a mild complaint about footwear. Her shoes, for instance, had been practical when she left home, but were now somewhere between regret and liability. She paused to rest beneath a tree that appeared particularly wise. The bark was ridged, like the forehead of someone who'd seen too much, and a branch hung low enough to brush her shoulder, as if offering unsolicited advice. "Don't," she muttered to the tree, which remained unimpressed. The wind stirred again, not strong, just enough to move a few leaves and whisper across the forest floor like gossip at a dinner party. Red imagined the trees chatting in low tones. "Oh, look," said one, rustling its leaves dramatically. "Another human with snacks." "At least this one has a cloak," sighed another. "The last one just wore beige." Appalling. If the forest did have opinions, they were mostly aesthetic. The deeper she went, the cooler it became. The air took on that damp, green stillness that only exists where sunlight struggles to reach. Tiny motes of dust drifted in golden beams, turning lazily, like they had nowhere in particular to be. And honestly, Red envied them. It was easy to imagine that time didn't pass here in any normal way. Perhaps the forest simply existed, ignoring the human calendar entirely, content to measure its days in rainfall and regrets. At one point she stopped again to listen. There was a rustle ahead, the faint shuffle of paws perhaps, or an unusually motivated squirrel. The sound came, then faded. "Probably just nature," she said aloud, to comfort herself. It didn't work. Still, it wasn't a bad kind of unease. It was the same feeling one might get being stared at by an especially polite dog, curious but not threatening. She imagined quite vividly that the forest contained at least one large, fluffy creature, watching her progress with the resigned interest of a parent at a school play. Hours, or possibly 15 minutes, might have passed. The rhythm of her footsteps became hypnotic, the rise and fall of her breathing syncing with the size of the forest. Every sound folded into another, the creak of trees, the chatter of leaves, the occasional indignant squawk of something feathered. If someone had asked Red at that moment what she was thinking about, she couldn't have said. Her thoughts had melted into a slow, soft hum, the kind that happens when your brain quietly agrees to take a nap while your body keeps walking. She began to notice small details, the kind most people miss. The way dew collected on spider webs, like tiny chandeliers, the faint shimmer of light on the back of a beetle, the precise way ferns uncurled, like the forest was practicing good posture. There was a comfort in it, the quiet order of a world that didn't care who you were, so long as you didn't litter. Eventually she reached a small stream cutting through the path. It burbled with cheerful self-importance, as if it had somewhere very important to be but was taking its time getting there. Red crouched down to look at her reflection, which was mildly distorted, as though the water were trying to improve her appearance but lacked confidence in its artistic ability. Her cloak, once bright, now speckled with adventure and dust, draped into the current. A small fish swam up, investigated the hem, and appeared deeply unimpressed. "Don't start," she told it. The fish darted away, scandalized. She stood, brushed her hands against her skirt, and took a deep breath. The air here felt different, heavier, like the forest wanted her to know she was trespassing but wasn't going to make a big deal about it. As she walked on, the trees began to thin slightly, and the sunlight grew bolder. The forest seemed to relax, as though deciding she wasn't a threat after all. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker began its industrious routine, the steady tock-tock-tock echoing like a metronome for daydreams. She thought again about her grandmother, the cottage, the bed by the fire, the faint smell of lavender and peppermint tea. It was a comforting image, though she couldn't help but note that her grandmother also lived very far away from literally everyone else, which felt suspicious in retrospect. Still, Red pressed on, humming faintly to herself. It wasn't a tune anyone would recognize. It was simply the melody of walking, that lazy, improvised sort of music that happens when the mind drifts and the feet do all the work. By the time she reached the first small clearing, the sun had tilted lower, gilding everything in soft amber. The trees stretched long shadows across the path as if to say, "That's far enough for today." Red paused again, setting the basket down for a moment to rest her arm. The bottle inside gave a little clink, reminding her that technically she was on official pastry business. She looked around. The quiet here was thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. And though she couldn't have said exactly why, she felt almost accompanied, not followed, not threatened, just quietly accompanied. Something, somewhere, watched with gentle curiosity. And if the creature had been asked what it thought of the girl in the red cloak, it might have said, if wolves could speak, well, at least she brought wine. She didn't know yet that the forest was a kind of threshold, the border between everything predictable and everything that wasn't. For now, it was simply a long, leafy corridor full of whispering branches, slightly neurotic birds, and the faint, comforting certainty that even when the world felt strange, it was still in its own way on her side. Red adjusted her cloak again, lifted the basket, and took another slow step forward. The trees leaned closer, curious, and somewhere in the distance a quiet laugh, or maybe just the wind, drifted through the woods, as if the forest itself was amused by the whole ridiculous business of being human. The forest began precisely where Red's patience ended. She'd stood at the edge of the path for several long, uncertain seconds, trying to decide whether the trees looked friendly or merely judgmental. They did not, she decided, look welcoming. They looked like the sort of trees that would hold a grudge, perhaps not against her personally, but against humanity in general, for centuries of what could only be described as axe-related misunderstandings. Still, she stepped forward, her boots crunching against a layer of leaves that had been artfully strewn about by autumn, as though nature were trying too hard to appear casual. The path wound forward, thin and dappled, sunlight dripping through branches like gold syrup. If she'd been a poet, she might have written about it, but Red was not a poet. She was, at best, a reluctant courier of carbohydrates. The forest had that quiet, dignified hush of places that think very highly of themselves. Each tree seemed to stand at attention, humming with mild disapproval. The oaks loomed grandly, the pines whispered conspiratorially, and the birches looked perpetually surprised to have been invited at all. Somewhere above, a bird chirped with the air of someone trying to be helpful, but not really succeeding. Another bird responded, clearly disagreeing. It was, Red realized, a small avian argument about absolutely nothing, nature's version of talk radio. She adjusted the basket on her arm. It was heavier than she remembered, though perhaps that was simply the weight of moral responsibility. The bread and butter clinked faintly against the bottle of wine, which was still pretending to be for medicinal purposes. The air smelled faintly of moss and mystery, and possibly mushrooms. The edible or existential kind, she wasn't sure. She walked slowly, because walking quickly felt like tempting fate, and besides, the forest had that way of stretching distances. Each turn in the path looked promising, like perhaps the next bend would reveal a charming clearing or a polite squirrel offering tea. Instead, it revealed more trees, all apparently part of the same leafy union and equally uninterested in her journey. There was, however, an undeniable sense of being observed, not in a sinister way, more like being silently judged by something large and furry. Red tried not to think about it too much. After all, she reasoned, she was a rational person, and rational people didn't invent woodland audiences. Still, she could have sworn she heard a rustle to her left. A faint exhale of breath that wasn't entirely wind. It was probably just the forest sighing, she thought. Nature seemed the sort to sigh often. As the path deepened, so did her thoughts. The woods had that effect, the kind of endless quiet that made one's mind wander off without permission. She thought about the strangeness of human travel, how every journey, no matter how noble in intention, eventually turned into a mild complaint about footwear. Her shoes, for instance, had been practical when she left home, but were now somewhere between regret and liability. She paused to rest beneath a tree that appeared particularly wise. The bark was ridged, like the forehead of someone who'd seen too much, and a branch hung low enough to brush her shoulder, as if offering unsolicited advice. "Don't," she muttered to the tree, which remained unimpressed. The wind stirred again, not strong, just enough to move a few leaves and whisper across the forest floor like gossip at a dinner party. Red imagined the trees chatting in low tones. "Oh, look," said one, rustling its leaves dramatically. "Another human with snacks." "At least this one has a cloak," sighed another. "The last one just wore beige. Appalling." If the forest did have opinions, they were mostly aesthetic. The deeper she went, the cooler it became. The air took on that damp, green stillness that only exists where sunlight struggles to reach. Tiny motes of dust drifted in golden beams, turning lazily, like they had nowhere in particular to be. And honestly, Red envied them. It was easy to imagine that time didn't pass here in any normal way. Perhaps the forest simply existed, ignoring the human calendar entirely, content to measure its days in rainfall and regrets. At one point she stopped again to listen. There was a rustle ahead, the faint shuffle of paws perhaps, or an unusually motivated squirrel. The sound came, then faded. "Probably just nature," she said aloud, to comfort herself. It didn't work. Still, it wasn't a bad kind of unease. It was the same feeling one might get being stared at by an especially polite dog, curious but not threatening. She imagined quite vividly that the forest contained at least one large, fluffy creature, watching her progress with the resigned interest of a parent at a school play. Hours, or possibly 15 minutes, might have passed. The rhythm of her footsteps became hypnotic, the rise and fall of her breathing syncing with the size of the forest. Every sound folded into another, the creak of trees, the chatter of leaves, the occasional indignant squawk of something feathered. If someone had asked Red at that moment what she was thinking about, she couldn't have said. Her thoughts had melted into a slow, soft hum, the kind that happens when your brain quietly agrees to take a nap while your body keeps walking. She began to notice small details, the kind most people miss. The way dew collected on spider webs, like tiny chandeliers, the faint shimmer of light on the back of a beetle, the precise way ferns uncurled, like the forest was practicing good posture. There was a comfort in it, the quiet order of a world that didn't care who you were, so long as you didn't litter. Eventually she reached a small stream cutting through the path. It burbled with cheerful self-importance, as if it had somewhere very important to be but was taking its time getting there. Red crouched down to look at her reflection, which was mildly distorted, as though the water were trying to improve her appearance but lacked confidence in its artistic ability. Her cloak, once bright, now speckled with adventure and dust, draped into the current. A small fish swam up, investigated the hem, and appeared deeply unimpressed. "Don't start," she told it. The fish darted away, scandalized. She stood, brushed her hands against her skirt, and took a deep breath. The air here felt different, heavier, like the forest wanted her to know she was trespassing but wasn't going to make a big deal about it. As she walked on, the trees began to thin slightly, and the sunlight grew bolder. The forest seemed to relax, as though deciding she wasn't a threat after all. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker began its industrious routine, the steady tock-tock-tock echoing like a metronome for daydreams. She thought again about her grandmother, the cottage, the bed by the fire, the faint smell of lavender and peppermint tea. It was a comforting image, though she couldn't help but note that her grandmother also lived very far away from literally everyone else, which felt suspicious in retrospect. Still, Red pressed on, humming faintly to herself. It wasn't a tune anyone would recognize. It was simply the melody of walking, that lazy, improvised sort of music that happens when the mind drifts and the feet do all the work. By the time she reached the first small clearing, the sun had tilted lower, gilding everything in soft amber. The trees stretched long shadows across the path as if to say, "That's far enough for today." Red paused again, setting the basket down for a moment to rest her arm. The bottle inside gave a little clink, reminding her that technically she was on official pastry business. She looked around. The quiet here was thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. And though she couldn't have said exactly why, she felt almost accompanied, not followed, not threatened, just quietly accompanied. Something, somewhere, watched with gentle curiosity. And if the creature had been asked what it thought of the girl in the red cloak, it might have said, if wolves could speak, well, at least she brought wine. She didn't know yet that the forest was a kind of threshold, the border between everything predictable and everything that wasn't. For now, it was simply a long, leafy corridor full of whispering branches, slightly neurotic birds, and the faint, comforting certainty that even when the world felt strange, it was still in its own way on her side. Red adjusted her cloak again, lifted the basket, and took another slow step forward. The trees leaned closer, curious, and somewhere in the distance a quiet laugh, or maybe just the wind, drifted through the woods, as if the forest itself was amused by the whole ridiculous business of being human. It was the sort of afternoon when the forest felt civilized. The air had that soft, golden patience of a place that had seen everything and expected very little from humanity. The trees were quieter now, leaning back as though to watch the story unfold, as stories inevitably did whenever someone naive met someone well-spoken. Red was humming faintly, a sound halfway between a tune and an exhale, when the wolf appeared. He didn't leap dramatically from the underbrush. He didn't even prowl, he simply arrived, like someone who had been there all along and was only now making the social decision to be noticed. He stepped onto the path with the unhurried grace of a creature who knew he was, by most definitions, the main event. His fur caught the light in tasteful streaks of grey and silver, the kind of natural elegance that comes from never caring what anyone thinks. "Good afternoon," he said. The voice was smooth, deep, and alarmingly articulate, the sort of voice that could sell expensive watches or convince a committee to extend a deadline. Red stopped mid-step, blinking. "Oh, hello." The wolf inclined his head politely. "Lovely day, isn't it?" It was objectively a lovely day, though Red couldn't help but notice that whenever someone says that, it's rarely about the weather. The wolf's expression was mild, almost academic. He studied her in the way one studies a recipe, carefully, but with a faint glimmer of ulterior motives. "Traveling, are we?" he asked. Red hesitated. "Yes, to my grandmother's." "Ah," said the wolf, "family duty, noble, tiresome." His eyes, sharp, amber, and unsettlingly intelligent, flicked toward the basket. "And bearing gifts, I see. Pastries. I'd imagine, possibly butter. A modest bottle of something that claims to be medicinal." Red blinked again. "Yes, actually," he smiled. "A lucky guess. I have an instinct for domestic logistics." There was a pause, the kind of pause that sits neatly between politeness and warning. The narrator, who was by now getting comfortable with commentary, might have stepped in to note that this was the moment, the exact moment when a sensible person might have said, "Lovely chatting, must dash," and walked away. But as history and human experience have repeatedly demonstrated, 90% of life's mistakes begin with the words, "I didn't want to be rude." And so, not wanting to be rude, Red stayed. The wolf, sensing her compliance, adjusted his tone to that of a modest civil servant. "If I might ask," he said casually, "where exactly does your grandmother reside?" Red, whose sense of self-preservation had apparently been outvoted by her sense of social obligation, answered, "Just beyond the clearing at the edge of the wood, a small cottage with a thatched roof." "Ah," said the wolf, "charming. I know the sort. Smells faintly of sage," and elderly advice. "Yes," Red said, smiling despite herself. He nodded thoughtfully, as if filing this away for purely demographic purposes. They began to walk, slowly, conversationally. Though walk might be generous, it was more like the wolf strolled, and Red tried to appear as though this were perfectly normal behavior. He asked questions in the way predators often do, as if conducting a survey. How far away was the cottage? Did her grandmother live alone? Was she by chance a sound sleeper? Each inquiry was phrased with immaculate courtesy, and each answer came out of Red's mouth before her brain had time to object. "That's fascinating," the wolf said finally, after gathering an alarming amount of data. "You must be a very devoted granddaughter." "I suppose so," she said. "I visit every week." "How admirable," said the wolf. "You know, not everyone maintains such familial consistency. Many people lose touch entirely. I myself haven't spoken to my own grandmother in, several generations." There was no appropriate response to this, so Red nodded politely. The wolf's politeness was relentless, the kind of civility that begins to feel vaguely threatening if you stare at it too long. He kept his voice low, melodic, the cadence of someone who'd spent far too much time around etiquette manuals. "Do you often travel alone?" "Usually, yes." "Brave," he said. "Or perhaps trusting." "I suppose trusting," she said. "Of course," said the wolf. "Trust is such a lovely, edible quality." There was a brief silence. "Pardon?" "Admirable quality," he corrected smoothly. "Admirable." "Ah," said Red. "Yes." The path curved, and the light shifted. A soft amber glow falling across the wolf's fur like gilded smoke. He looked, Red thought, rather distinguished for a woodland carnivore. He had that air of someone who read extensively, and was perhaps a little disappointed in most of what he'd read. "Forgive me," the wolf said, "if this seems forward, but have you considered how terribly inconvenient your route is?" "My route?" "Yes, through the forest alone, burdened by carbohydrates. The path to your grandmother's house is full of unnecessary detours. You could save at least half an hour if you took the ridge trail." Red frowned. "Isn't that steeper?" "Steeper, yes, but faster, and much more scenic. The sort of shortcut that makes one feel competent and worldly." He smiled again, that same mild, persuasive smile that made it sound like he was offering travel insurance. The narrator might have intervened again, clearing their throat softly, to note that shortcuts are almost always the scenic route to disaster. But Red wasn't listening to narrative foreshadowing. She was nodding. "Perhaps I'll try it." "Splendid," said the wolf, with the faint enthusiasm of someone who's just confirmed dinner plans. "I'll continue along this path myself just to ensure the route remains." "Clear." "How thoughtful," Red said. "It's in my nature," the wolf replied, which, if you think about it, was one of the most honest things he ever said. They walked a few more steps together, the forest pressing close around them. The wolf glanced at her again as if genuinely curious. "You know," he said, "people misunderstand wolves terribly. We're painted as villains in every tale, all teeth and malice, but really most of us are just practical." "Practical?" "Of course. We eat, we sleep, we contribute meaningfully to the ecosystem. We have complex emotional lives. The occasional craving, yes, but who doesn't?" "I suppose that's true," Red said uncertainly. The wolf gave a small, self-satisfied sigh. "Exactly. See, the problem with humans is narrative bias. Once you're labeled the big bad, it's terribly hard to get good press." "I imagine," she said. "Imagine?" "My dear, I live it." They stopped near a cluster of ferns. The air had gone still, the kind of stillness that feels polite but expectant, like a waiter hovering too long at your table. The wolf bowed slightly. "I mustn't delay you further. Grandmothers, after all, wait for no one." "Oh," Red said. "But it was nice to talk." "The pleasure was mine," he said smoothly. "Travel safely, and should you need assistance along the way." He let the thought trail off delicately. "I'll manage," she said. "Of course you will," said the wolf. "Everyone always thinks they will." Red turned to continue along the path, feeling strangely lighter. It was nice, she decided, to have met such a well-mannered conversationalist in the woods. Not at all what one expected from the cautionary tales. Behind her, the wolf lingered a moment longer. Then, with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd Already made up his mind, he turned and slipped through the undergrowth, silent, purposeful, and humming faintly to himself, as if planning a dinner party menu. The forest resumed its usual business of being mysterious and slightly passive-aggressive. A few birds started up again, whispering their opinions about what they'd just seen. Red adjusted her cloak, sighed contentedly, and thought to herself how nice it was that some animals were civilized. The narrator, of course, said nothing, because there are moments in every story when commentary is useless, and the only appropriate sound is the soft, inevitable creak of plot development. And somewhere ahead, in the amber hush of late afternoon, a polite, well-spoken, deeply concerning wolf was taking the scenic route, with a plan, a purpose, and the faintest air of professional pride. If the forest had been quietly disapproving before, now it had relaxed into something almost companionable. The air was warm, lazy, and pleasantly indifferent. Sunlight trickled through the leaves in soft patches, painting the path in uneven, golden, like nature's attempt at interior design. Red walked slowly, no longer in any particular hurry. The conversation with the wolf, though mildly unsettling in hindsight, had left her oddly thoughtful. Perhaps, she reasoned, he was just one of those misunderstood types. People always judged others too quickly. She adjusted the basket on her arm. It was growing lighter, though not because she'd eaten anything. No, it was that strange illusion of progress, the feeling that if you walked long enough, even burdens began to feel like habits. And besides, it was such a lovely day to be distracted. The first distraction came in the form of flowers. They were everywhere, in clusters and carpets and subtle explosions of color. Wildflowers of every kind, arranged with the effortless grace of something that had never been told to tidy up. Red stopped to admire them, crouching slightly, inhaling the faint perfume of meadow and mild confusion. The air smelled green, that impossible shade of scent that only happens when the sun warms the grass just enough to make it smell like memory. She picked one, then another, then decided she might as well make a bouquet because nothing says urgent delivery like stopping halfway through to do crafts. The narrator might have gently reminded her that Grandma was still waiting, but the narrator, like the forest, had resigned itself to human nature. As Red arranged her growing bouquet, a squirrel appeared on a nearby branch, watching her with the sharp, judgmental eyes of a creature that had seen things. It flicked its tail in what could only be described as disapproval. "Good morning," Red said politely. The squirrel blinked, unimpressed. "Lovely weather, isn't it?" A pause. Then, with a chirp that sounded suspiciously like a scoff, it darted higher into the tree, clearly unwilling to associate with someone who picked flowers recreationally. Well, Red said to no one in particular, that was rude. The squirrel didn't respond, but a pine cone dropped from above, landing near her feet. She took that as the forest's version of feedback. She continued along the path, flowers tucked into her basket, humming softly to herself. The forest was alive with quiet noises, bees murmuring over blossoms, leaves brushing against each other like pages turning, the occasional distant thud of something that had either fallen or given up. There was a kind of hypnotic rhythm to it all, the rustle of her cloak, the creak of her boots, the gentle shifting of branches above, the soundscape of existing. It occurred to her that perhaps this was what peace felt like, an aimless sort of contentment, entirely detached from purpose. Further along, she came across a patch of mushrooms, perfectly round, arranged in a ring, so suspiciously symmetrical that it could only mean trouble. Red crouched again, studying them with scientific curiosity. "Fairy ring," she murmured, "or possibly just mushrooms with boundary issues." A nearby bird chirped, a sound that somehow managed to convey judgment. "Oh, don't start," she told it. The bird tilted its head, unimpressed, then gave a single, sharp note before flying off, a small, feathery explosion of disapproval. "Like the squirrel better," Red said. She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt, and continued walking, slower now, half listening to the quiet argument of the wind and the leaves. Somewhere, not too far away, another sound threaded through the stillness, the faint, purposeful rustle of something larger. The wolf. He was already gone from this stretch of forest. having taken the shortcut he'd so helpfully recommended. His movement was a quiet ripple through the undergrowth, a shadow that didn't so much pass through the woods as around them, like a rumor. If you could have followed him, which you couldn't, because he was very good at not being followed, you'd have seen a creature entirely unlike the polite conversationalist Red had met. He was focused now, efficient, not cruel exactly, but operating within a very old system of priorities: opportunity, hunger, and the occasional lapse in conscience. He moved with the soundless confidence of someone who'd long ago accepted his own nature and saw no point in apologizing for it. Back on the main path, Red had found another distraction, a patch of sunlight so perfectly warm that it felt like a personal invitation. She stopped in the middle of it, tilting her face upward, eyes closed. The world went golden behind her eyelids. She could hear the faint pulse of her own heartbeat, syncing with the gentle rustle of the forest, a duet of quiet persistence. If someone had asked her at that moment what she was thinking about, she might have said nothing, but that wouldn't have been true. She was thinking about everything, in the lazy, disorganized way one does when there's no reason not to. She thought about her grandmother's hands, always smelling of flower and lavender. She thought about her mother, stern and loving in equal measure. She thought about the wolf, his strange civility, his amber eyes that seemed to know too much. Then she thought about pastries and how she should have packed a second bottle of wine, and then about how really life was just a series of errands disguised as purpose. When she opened her eyes again, a blue butterfly hovered in front of her face. It flitted there delicately, as if inspecting her credentials. Then, apparently satisfied, it drifted away toward a patch of daisies, unconcerned with her existential musings. "Good talk," she said quietly. The forest, in response, offered a breeze, the kind that feels like an approving pat on the shoulder. Meanwhile, far ahead, the wolf was nearing the edge of the wood. He had crossed the stream, followed the ridge trail, and now stood overlooking the small clearing where Grandma's cottage sat, a quaint little structure built out of optimism and questionable insulation. He watched it with mild curiosity, head tilted, calculating. There was smoke from the chimney, the faint hum of domestic tranquility. He sighed softly, not from guilt, but from that particular kind of melancholy that comes from knowing you're about to do something terribly predictable, because the truth, dear listener, is that some peoples and some wolves simply cannot wait for things to go wrong. They have to help, and so he adjusted his posture, smoothed his expression into something appropriately benign, and padded toward the door. Back on the forest path, Red had resumed walking, though walking might have been too strong a word. It was more of a gentle, meandering float through space, her thoughts somewhere between daydream and nap. She stopped occasionally to inspect moss, to marvel at the artistry of spiderwebs, to lose herself in the small, insignificant miracles of the world. A fallen log became a throne, a cluster of stones a court, a particularly round toadstool, a philosophical companion. She smiled to herself. "Honestly," she murmured, "if this is what distraction feels like, perhaps I should get lost more often." The forest agreed, rustling its approval. The day had softened now, the sunlight turning syrupy, the air cooling in slow sighs. Somewhere behind her, a woodpecker tapped at a tree with the persistence of someone practicing Morse code badly. Red didn't mind. Every sound was part of the rhythm, the gentle percussion of existence, the lullaby of the woods. For a moment, she felt perfectly in tune with everything, the trees, the breeze, even the faint scolding of birds. It was all one grand, indifferent harmony, and she was content to be its smallest note. Far ahead, a polite knock echoed at Grandma's door. Red didn't hear it, of course. She was still marveling at a particularly shiny rock, but the forest did. And though trees don't gossip, officially, one could sense a ripple moving through the branches, a collective rustle, as if nature itself was leaning forward to see what would happen next, because stories like forests have their own awareness. They know when a turning point arrives. They feel it in their roots. And this one, the story, the forest, the world itself, was quietly bracing for what came next. For now, though, Red smiled, tucked a final flower behind her ear, and continued, along the dappled path, entirely unaware that elsewhere a very polite wolf was making himself comfortable in a chair that did not belong to him. But that, as the narrator wisely chose not to mention aloud, was a problem for later. The wolf, it must be said, was not a natural runner. He had the legs for it, certainly, long, sinewy things that looked as though they were designed for bounding through meadows or fleeing moral consequences. But he was also, in spirit, deeply sedentary. His preferred activity was conversation, followed closely by digestion, and distantly by schemes of questionable merit. Still, when Red mentioned her grandmother's cottage, and more importantly, the basket of food, something shifted in him, a spark of opportunism, a quiet, hungry practicality that had guided wolves for centuries, and occasionally gotten them into messes that were more complicated than necessary. And so he trotted off through the trees, head held high, like a gentleman late to a luncheon he hadn't technically been invited to. The forest greeted him with its usual blend of indifference and mild suspicion. A pair of finches stopped mid-gossip to stare. Somewhere a fox paused its scavenging to mutter, "Here we go again." By the time the wolf reached the edge of the clearing, his breath was coming in dignified, restrained huffs, the kind one does when pretending not to be winded. Before him sat Grandma's cottage, which, even by rural architectural standards, was aspirational. It leaned slightly to the left, as though it had once tried to get a better view of the sunset, and never quite straightened up again. The thatched roof was patchy in places, and the chimney emitted smoke with all the optimism of a retiree starting a new hobby. The door, painted a once cheerful blue, was now a faded shade of hopeful mildew. The entire place smelled faintly of soup and recent decisions. The wolf stood outside for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He had not, to his knowledge, ever impersonated an elderly woman before. It was not a skill covered in the usual forest curriculum, which mostly focused on tracking and how to look menacing without trying. Still, he fancied himself adaptable. There was, he reasoned, no great difference between a wolf and a grandmother beyond the superficial. A few teeth here, a shawl there, and perhaps a more nuanced relationship with the concept of knitting. He knocked once on the door, out of formality, then, receiving no answer, let himself in. The cottage interior was a study in rustic compromise. Every surface carried the faint patina of time, dust, and enthusiasm that had waned around the 5th decade. A kettle sat on the stove, long boiled dry but stubbornly waiting to be useful again. A pair of spectacles lay on the table beside an open book whose plot had clearly been abandoned mid-sentence. In the corner, a framed picture of Grandma's younger days stared out with the serene expression of someone who hadn't yet realized how many wolves life would send her way. The wolf paced around, trying to orient himself. There were many ways to go about this, none of them good. He could, for instance, hide and wait, but hiding, he decided, would make him look guilty, and guilt was not a good look on anyone hoping to pass for a sweet old lady. He could also pretend to be Grandma immediately, though that seemed premature. He sat down on the edge of the bed, which creaked under him with the sort of sound that suggested it was filing a complaint with the nearest carpenter. "Well," he muttered to himself, "she's bound to be late. They always are, those earnest, slow-walking types." He had, of course, no real evidence for this assumption, but like many of his opinions, it sounded plausible enough to be comforting. To pass the time, he explored the pantry, which was mostly a museum of ingredients that had outlived their intended purpose. Dried herbs hung in bunches that smelled vaguely of healing and mold. A jar of honey had crystallized into something that looked weaponizable. And in the back corner sat a loaf of bread so stale it could have qualified as a building material. It was, he thought, impressive how long humans could persist on the illusion of food. After several minutes of quiet rummaging and one half-hearted attempt to make tea, he poured hot water into an empty cup and stared at it, hoping flavor would arrive by moral persuasion. He decided to get practical. If he was to impersonate Grandma, he would need to commit. Now, commitment is a dangerous thing in the hands, in a pause, of the overly confident. It transforms what might have been a brief lapse in judgment into an entire act of theater. The wolf found a nightgown hanging from a peg near the bed, patterned with faded pink roses and held together by sheer willpower. He slipped it on as best he could, tearing the seams in 2 places but deciding it added character. Then came the bonnet, a marvel of lace and elastic that immediately regretted being stretched over a wolf's head. He tied it beneath his chin with surprising delicacy, stepped back to view himself in a cracked mirror, and paused. He looked horrifying, but also somehow dedicated. There was a moment of quiet reflection in which he realized he had become a metaphor for every bad decision made with confidence and poor lighting. Still, he pressed on. He pulled the quilt up to his chin, adjusted his posture, and practiced a few lines aloud. "Hello, dear. Come in, my precious. Do help yourself to some bread that tastes like furniture." Each came out with varying degrees of menace. He cleared his throat and tried again, softening his tone until it hovered somewhere between grandmotherly and sleep paralysis demon. That, he thought, would have to do. Outside, the wind shifted. The afternoon sun slanted through the cottage window, bathing the room in a sleepy amber haze. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, like tiny judgmental ghosts of better housekeeping that barked. Wolf waited, and as he did, his thoughts began to wander, as thoughts tend to do when one is sitting in a stranger's nightgown, in a borrowed bed, waiting to commit minor to moderate deception. He wondered about Grandma herself. Where had she gone? Was she out gathering herbs, visiting friends, attending some sort of rural symposium on the correct use of cardigans? Or perhaps she was simply out back, napping under a tree. A perfectly reasonable pastime that would, unfortunately, complicate the afternoon's unfolding drama. The narrator, that would be me, would like to pause here to observe that this entire situation could have been prevented by any number of sensible choices. For instance, Red could have said no to the errand. Her mother could have said perhaps not through the carnivore-dense part of the woods. The wolf could have, at any point, gone home and made himself a sandwich. But alas, such is the momentum of poor decision-making. Once set in motion, it rarely stops until something dramatic, or at least mildly farcical, occurs. The wolf shifted under the quilt, which smelled faintly of lavender and old stories. He found it oddly comforting. There was something undeniably soothing about pretending to be someone else in a place that wasn't yours. It gave one the illusion of control, of being, however briefly, the author of one's own narrative. He closed his eyes and took a long, steady breath. The rhythm of the forest outside mingled with the creaks of the cottage, creating a kind of accidental lullaby. And for a few peaceful minutes, the wolf, criminally overdressed and mildly delusional, drifted into the soft half-sleep of someone who has convinced himself everything is going according to plan. But it was not. Not exactly. Because, as the narrator must now reveal, Grandma had not wandered off for herbs or naps or philosophical reflection. She had in fact been sitting quietly in her garden behind the cottage this whole time, trimming her herbs and minding her business, until she heard what could only be described as a wolf trying to fit into a dress. And while she was old, she was not oblivious. She peered through the window just in time to see the wolf arranging the bedclothes, adjusting his bonnet, and muttering in falsetto. There was a long pause. Then she sighed, the kind of sigh that belongs to someone who has seen too much nonsense and has no energy left for panic. "Well," she murmured, setting down her shears, "I suppose we're doing this again." Grandma was by temperament pragmatic. This was not her first encounter with foolishness, and it would not be her last. She decided, in a rare moment of wisdom, to simply step out quietly and let events unfold. Better, she reasoned, to let the story have its way. After all, she'd lived long enough to know that sometimes life insists on being ridiculous, and the only dignified response is to make a cup of tea and wait it out. Inside, the wolf stirred, adjusting his posture and practicing one last round of grandmotherly expressions in the mirror. His reflection, which now bore a striking resemblance to a fever dream in lace, stared back with unwavering commitment. He smiled faintly, satisfied with the illusion. The stage was set. The audience, one small, well-meaning girl in a hood, would soon arrive. And outside, as the wind rustled through the trees, the world itself seemed to lean in, eager to see how badly things might go wrong. By the time Red Riding Hood reached her grandmother's cottage, she had long since lost all sense of heroic purpose. Her shoes, which had seemed perfectly adequate when she left home, were now two moist reminders that practicality was rarely fashionable. Her cloak, damp at the edges and covered in twigs, had become less a garment and more a mobile compost heap. And her hair, oh her hair, had rebelled entirely, rearranging itself into the kind of structure birds might consider a starter home. The basket hung from her arm at a despondent angle, its contents having shifted several times over the course of her journey. The bread was a little squashed, the butter a little too soft, and the small bottle of wine, well, it was noticeably lighter, though she refused to comment on why. All in all, Red looked less like a girl delivering cheer to an elderly relative, and more like someone arriving at the world's most disappointing retreat. The cottage, when she reached it, was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was larger now, a thought that filled her with a faint, misplaced pride. She stood at the gate for a long moment, taking in the scene. The door stood slightly ajar, as though waiting for her, or possibly giving up on privacy altogether. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone inside had at least attempted warmth, or had recently set something on fire and decided to pretend it was on purpose. Red straightened her cloak, took a deep breath that smelled faintly of damp moss and self-doubt, and stepped forward. "Grandmother," she called softly, peering through the open door. From within came a voice, high-pitched, a little gravelly, and vibrating with the effort of forced cheer. "Come in, my dear," said the voice. "I'm resting." The tone carried that peculiar mix of enthusiasm and discomfort that suggested someone both deeply committed to a lie and regretting it in real time. Red hesitated at the threshold. She'd grown up on cautionary advice about stranger danger, but it had mostly been delivered by people who later encouraged her to go play in the woods alone, so the moral authority was questionable. Still, she stepped inside. The cottage was as she remembered it, cozy in the way that means small, tidy in the way that means there's nowhere else to put things. The air smelled of lavender, dust, and something faintly animal, though she dismissed that as an uncharitable thought. The curtains were drawn, letting in a sleepy sort of light that made everything look a little softer and perhaps a little suspicious. In the bed by the far wall, a figure stirred, bundled under a heavy quilt, wearing an aggressively floral nightgown and a bonnet that looked slightly stretched. "Grandmother," Red said, stepping closer, "you look, well." It was a generous statement. Now, to her credit, Red was not unobservant. She noticed at once that her grandmother appeared somewhat altered. The face beneath the bonnet was furrier than usual. The hands, clutching the blanket, were large and oddly clawed. The voice, when it spoke again, carried a rasp like sandpaper wrapped in politeness. But here's the thing about politeness. It's a powerful social anesthetic. Even when faced with evidence that something is profoundly wrong, most people will smile, nod, and try not to cause a fuss, and Red, having been raised to value good manners above survival instincts, did precisely that. "My grandmother," she began, her tone bright with forced composure. "What big eyes you have, Diwa." Figure on the bed shifted slightly. "The better to see you with, my dear," came the reply, delivered in a tone that hovered between grandmotherly affection and light predation. Red nodded thoughtfully, as though evaluating a new fashion choice rather than a biological impossibility. "Yes, of course, very practical." There was a pause. She took another cautious step closer. "And what big ears you have." The figure smiled, or perhaps bared its teeth. "The better to hear you with, my dear." "Ah, lovely," Red murmured. "So many people your age struggle with hearing. You must be quite pleased." The wolf, for we may as well stop pretending, was sweating internally. His disguise, always tenuous, had begun to falter under the scrutiny of polite conversation. The bonnet itched terribly. His paws, now tucked under the blanket, were beginning to cramp, and the air was thick with the scent of suspicion, or perhaps pastry. Still, he soldiered on, because once one commits to a charade, the only dignified option is to see it through until either success or catastrophe. Red, meanwhile, continued her cautious investigation, still unwilling to accuse her own grandmother of being, well, a large carnivorous mammal in nightwear. She took another step forward, her brow furrowed. "What did big hands you have?" she said finally. "The better to hold you with, my dear." "Right," Red said, nodding slowly. "That's an interesting turn of phrase, Grandma. You've been reading those self-help pamphlets again, haven't you?" The wolf blinked. "Possibly," he said, in a voice that was half growl, half regret. There was a long pause, the kind that stretches between two people both pretending not to notice that one of them is obviously a wolf. Red adjusted her cloak. "You know," she said gently, "it's funny. For a moment I thought you looked a bit different, but of course the lighting in here is dreadful. It makes everyone look rather toothy." At that, the wolf's tail, which he had been doing his best to keep still under the blanket, gave a single treacherous wag. Red's eyes narrowed. "Grandmother," she said slowly, "what big teeth you have." There it was, the inevitable line. The moment that had been waiting patiently in every version of this story since time immemorial. "The better to eat you with, my dear," the wolf said, and instantly regretted it. Because really that's not a thing one says conversationally. It's the kind of phrase that, once uttered aloud, leaves no room for backpedaling. There was a stunned silence. Red blinked. "Well," she said at last, "that escalated quickly." Now, to be clear, she did not scream. Screaming, she felt, would be gauche, and besides, she wasn't entirely convinced this wasn't some elaborate family prank. Instead, she set the basket down carefully, as though negotiating with fate. "Grandmother," she said, her tone somewhere between weary and mildly offended, "I do wish you'd warned me before lunch that we were doing performance art." The wolf hesitated. His instinct said pounce, but his conscience, or perhaps indigestion, said pause. They stared at each other for a long, uncomfortable beat, like two actors in a play who've both forgotten their lines and are hoping the other will improvise salvation. The narrator, that's me again, feels compelled to note that this is what we might call the social collapse point. It's that precise moment in every awkward encounter when pretending everything is fine simply becomes impossible. When the teacup of civility has cracked and the absurdity begins to spill out in slow motion. Red, bless her, was the first to break the silence. "You're not Grandma, are you?" The wolf sighed, a long, theatrical exhale of resignation. "No," he admitted softly. "No, I'm not." "Well," Red said, folding her arms, "that explains the fur. What happened next depends on which storyteller you ask. Some say the wolf lunged and chaos ensued. Others say a passing woodsman heroically intervened. But in this telling, in this calm, gently ridiculous version of events, what happened was far more civilized." Red sat down in the nearest chair, weary and mildly exasperated. The wolf, relieved to drop the pretense, adjusted the bonnet one last time and sighed in profound relief. "Well," he said, "this was all terribly awkward." "It really was," Red agreed. "Next time, just send a note." Outside, the forest carried on as if nothing had happened, the wind in the trees, the birds gossiping about something far more interesting. Inside, two exhausted participants, in an age-old misunderstanding, sat quietly, unsure whether to laugh, faint, or make tea. And as the sunlight softened across the cottage floor, the story, for now, settled into a kind of peace. Not an ending, precisely. Just a pause, the calm between absurdities, the quiet before the next chapter of consequences. Somewhere beyond the forest, in a clearing slightly less civilized than the last, the huntsman trudged along the path. He was not, by any reasonable definition, heroic. He was, however, exceedingly competent at arriving late. Late to work. Late to meals, late to moments of dramatic import. It was a skill honed over decades, often involving long sighs, half-empty coffee cups, and the occasional existential muttering. His uniform, a muted green with brass buttons tarnished by decades of woodland bureaucracy, clung uncomfortably to his frame. There were pockets for notebooks, measuring tape, spare pencils, and 3 forms no one ever filled out correctly. He kept checking the time, though it had long since lost all relevance. The huntsman's job, which was poorly understood by the general public, could roughly be summarized as attending to forest-related incidents without creating paperwork crises. He was overworked, underpaid, and perpetually behind schedule. Most of the forest creatures regarded him with a mixture of respect and pity. On this particular afternoon, the huntsman had been enjoying what one might politely call a long walk with existential dread. He had left his office hoping for quiet, some fresh air, and the satisfaction of an empty logbook. Instead, he had stumbled across a very unusual scene. A small girl, a wolf in a floral nightgown, and the faintly suspicious aroma of pastries gone slightly stale. He stopped, adjusted his hat, and blinked. "Well," he said softly, "this is not what I signed up for." The wolf, momentarily distracted by a crease in the quilt, noticed him immediately. "Ah," he said, "the backup plan has arrived." Red, who was still recovering from the social trauma of polite horror, looked up with a faintly exhausted expression. The huntsman stepped inside the doorway, frowning at the interior of the cottage, as though it were a report to be filed. "Permit me to explain," he began, tone weary but precise. "I am here in my official capacity as a forest compliance officer for, general wolf-related affairs, and possibly other things, mostly paperwork." The wolf tilted his head politely, though there was a twitch of irritation behind his ears. "I see," he said. "Another civil servant. Excellent. That should make this easier." Red raised her eyebrows. "It seems," she said, "that everyone in this story has arrived late or underprepared." The huntsman nodded, as though auditing a file. "Exactly, it's the modern condition, really. Now I need to verify several things before the situation escalates. The identity of the wolf, the current occupancy of this residence, and whether anyone has accidentally created a hostile environment in violation of Section 42B, unlicensed. Wolf-related incidents." The wolf coughed delicately. "I assure you, madam, this is entirely within my jurisdiction of recreational mischief." Red, for her part, was suppressing the urge to laugh. She had long since given up trying to reconcile politeness with the absurdity of her life. The huntsman, however, was completely unamused. He scribbled something in his notebook with the dedication of a man chronicling inevitable failure. "So," he said finally, adjusting his glasses, "the girl is unharmed?" "Yes," Red replied. "So far all moderately safe." "Good," he said. "That reduces paperwork, although I suspect some paperwork is now inevitable." The wolf, still under the quilt, twitched his tail. "This is excessively procedural." "Excessive? Yes," the huntsman agreed. "But it's required. Very few people understand the consequences of informal wolf visits. Most underestimate the need for proper documentation, and frankly, we can't have another incident like last Thursday, with the hedgehog and the improperly labeled blackberry pie." Red tilted her head. "I wasn't aware that was a thing." The huntsman shook his head gravely. "Oh, it was. Terribly unfortunate. Administrative nightmare." They spent several minutes in what could only be described as slow negotiation. Wolf tried to explain his presence using terms like surprise social visit and cultural enrichment, which the huntsman ignored. Red offered intermittent commentary. "I do think a warning might have been nice, and perhaps next time a note would suffice, and honestly the pastries were quite edible before all this." The air was thick with calm absurdity. The huntsman finally sighed and closed his notebook with the kind of finality that only comes from paperwork deemed both inevitable and useless. "Right," he said. "We have established the girl is present and minimally threatened. The wolf is in fact a wolf. The situation is for now contained. I will note the infraction, minimal risk, but follow-up is necessary. One can never be too cautious with recreational mischief." The wolf yawned. "I see. So bureaucracy prevents chaos. How reassuring." "It's not reassurance," the huntsman replied. "It's procedure. Very dull procedure. But procedure is what keeps the forest slightly less lethal than it otherwise would be. Red, reflecting on all of this, decided to sit in the nearest chair and remove her damp cloak. It was, she concluded, better to observe the bureaucratic process quietly than to interfere. The wolf, noticing her absence from the bed, shifted under the quilt and muttered something about loose ends. The huntsman, meanwhile, made an exhaustive inventory of the room: quilt, nightgown, bonnet, wolf paws, and lingering scent of pastries. Each item was assigned a small footnote in the notebook, with the kind of precision only someone obsessed with minor regulation could muster. Eventually, the conversation reached its natural conclusion. None of the participants had any intention of moving, and no further escalation seemed imminent. Red sipped at the basket's wine, the small, socially unremarkable portion, and watched the two adults and one lupine, one human, negotiate the absurdity of reality. It was, she thought, the perfect example of how life works. A series of mismanaged plans, polite deception, and minor disasters carefully annotated by those who were too responsible to walk away. The huntsman stood at last, stretching, glancing at the clock on the wall that had long stopped pretending to be useful. "Very well," he said. "I'll leave a formal note in the registry for follow-up inspections. Perhaps a citation, just a gentle reminder, and I'll make sure to recommend a training seminar for all parties involved." He paused. "Mostly the wolf." The wolf twitched. "Remarkable efficiency." Red sipped her wine. "I think we're all learning something," she said. The huntsman shook his head. "Mostly paperwork," he corrected. He departed at last, stepping through the doorway and giving the cottage a measured, tired glance, as if to say, "I've done my part, now you deal with it." Outside, he muttered about the inefficiency of unlicensed woodland creatures and wondered whether anyone would ever appreciate the effort required to keep the forest running smoothly. Inside, Red and the wolf remained quiet now, in the gentle calm that follows minor bureaucratic resolution, and the forest, as always, continued its patient observation, indifferent, mildly amused, and just a touch judgmental. The dust, if one could call it that, had finally settled. Not dramatically like a volcanic eruption or a minor apocalypse, but in the soft, inevitable way that all disturbances eventually surrender to gravity and inertia. Red sat in the chair closest to the window, her feet tucked neatly under her, surveying the room. The wolf, now removed from the nightgown and bonnet that had so catastrophically betrayed him, slouched in a corner, looking faintly guilty and only mildly disappointed in himself. Grandma, ever pragmatic, stood with hands on her hips, surveying the scene like an officer inspecting a slightly messy barracks. "Well," she said at last, in that calm, steady way of someone who had lived long enough to know that crises, much like laundry, always return. "That could have gone worse." Red nodded slowly. "Yes," she agreed. "Much worse, possibly involving actual injury or an unfortunate misplacement of pastries." The wolf made a soft sound that could have been agreement or apology, or a combination of both. He shifted, careful not to dislodge anything fragile, and considered his next move. Grandma began the cleanup quietly, moving around with the sort of calm efficiency that only comes from decades of experience in domestic diplomacy. She swept crumbs from the floor with precise, deliberate motions and organized the basket of food. The bread slightly flatter than it had been, the butter partially smudged, and the wine, mercifully, largely untouched. Red, observing this, realized that part of growing up, or perhaps part of existing, involved learning how to follow someone else's lead, even when that lead involved cleaning up after a wolf in a nightgown. She helped where she could, arranging flowers and replacing the dislodged teacups. Each movement was slow, deliberate, meditative. The rhythm of domesticity, even when tinged with absurdity, was calming. The wolf, sensing that his role in the story had diminished, quietly considered departure. He was not punished, he was not scolded exactly, but he had acquired a sort of soft, bureaucratic censure. It was the kind that makes one leave politely, imagining a transfer to another woodland, as if employment could be reassigned like paper forms in a filing cabinet. He stood, stretched, and made a dignified, if slightly awkward, exit through the door. The forest outside, ever patient, rustled its approval or perhaps its ambivalence. It was difficult to tell, as the forest rarely spoke directly, but the leaves' gentle shimmer suggested mild amusement at the resolution of events. Inside the cottage, Grandma poured tea with the serenity of someone who had survived far worse than a polite wolf and a slightly frazzled granddaughter. Red sipped slowly, noticing the warmth seeping into her hands, the faint aroma of herbs, and the comforting sound of steam rising from the teapot. There was something profoundly ordinary about this act, comforting in its quiet ritual. A small but important victory. That the world, for all its absurdity, still offered simple pleasures. Grandma sat across from her, a faint smile playing on her lips. Lessons, she said, are often overrated. Sometimes it's enough to notice that everything survived. And the tea is warm. Red nodded, taking a contemplative sip. She felt vaguely but meaningfully that she had grown. Or at least, she had acquired the kind of quiet insight one carries home after walking through chaos with a moderate level of grace. The room smelled faintly of herbs, pastries, and mild exasperation. Sunlight slanted through the window, gilding the dust motes as they drifted lazily through the air. Everything seemed in its proper place, not perfect, not pristine, but stable, which was often better. Red glanced at the now empty corner where the wolf had briefly been. "Well," she murmured, "he'll probably find another forest, hopefully with fewer teacups and more personal space." Grandma chuckled softly. "Some people," she said, "learn their lessons slowly, others very slowly. But all crises end the same way, with a deep breath, a cup of tea, and the realization that things could have gone worse." Red nodded again, smiling faintly. "Yes," she said, "that seems about right." The afternoon stretched on in gentle, soothing increments. Crumbs were swept, teacups refilled, and the forest outside whispered its patient commentary. Red arranged the flowers from her basket in a vase, noticing how the colors caught the light, how ordinary chaos could yield quiet beauty. Grandma hummed softly while folding a stray shawl. Even the chairs seemed content, upright and dignified after their brief entanglement with absurdity. Red realized, with a mild but genuine satisfaction, that sometimes adventures ended not with heroics, but with simple recovery. Not every story required a grand conclusion, just small acts of care and an acknowledgement of survival. The wolf, outside now, padded quietly through his reassigned woodland, reflecting on the inefficiency of human habits and the unpredictable nature of polite girls. He wondered briefly if he'd been judged, but quickly decided not to care. There were other forests, other pastries, and other mild bureaucratic consequences awaiting him elsewhere. Meanwhile, inside, Red and Grandma finished their tea. It was strong, soothing, and entirely unremarkable, and that perhaps was the point. The narrator, or patient as ever, notes that most crises resolve quietly. There are no fireworks, no dramatic revelations. Mostly there is tea, there are crumbs, there are half-learned lessons, and there is the faint, enduring sense that yes, everything survived, and really that is enough. Red leaned back, her feet finally resting, her basket empty except for a few stray petals. She looked around the cottage, at the slightly crooked furniture, the still sweet smell of pastries, and her grandmother's calm presence. "Well," she said softly, "that could have gone worse." And indeed, it had not. Evening arrived with the quiet insistence of something inevitable, the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself loudly, but creeps in gradually, like a cat settling across a warm lap. Red sat near the window, the remnants of her tea cooling gently in the cup. Outside, the forest exhaled a sigh of wind that rustled through branches with the gentle rhythm of a lullaby. Somewhere a distant owl hooted, not alarmingly, merely as if to remind the world that someone somewhere was still observing. The cottage was warm now, bathed in the soft flicker of candlelight. Shadows danced lazily across the walls, elongating and shrinking in time with the flame, like stories stretching to fit their audience. The narrator, your faithful, slightly weary observer, notes that humans in their wisdom often complicate the simplest of errands. A trip through the woods, a basket of food, a few minor lapses in judgment, all can accumulate into a series of events that feel, in the moment, like a cosmic test. Yet in hindsight, most of these incidents are less about morality or heroism and more about courtesy, stubbornness, and the inexplicable tendency to walk where one probably shouldn't. Red, in her chair, reflected on this quietly. She thought of her mother, with her relentless errands and ambiguous love language. She thought of her grandmother, calm and pragmatic, with the ability to restore order with a broom and a teacup. And she thought of the wolf, currently reassigned somewhere else, perhaps pondering his life choices, perhaps considering pastry etiquette. Life, she realized, was a little like walking through the forest. Sometimes you meander, sometimes you take shortcuts, and sometimes you encounter things best left politely acknowledged and slightly feared. The candle flickered again, casting gentle, warm light across the table. Red's eyes softened as she watched the shadows play on the walls. She listened to the quiet hum of evening, the faint hiss of the fire, the occasional creak of the cottage settling, the distant call of nocturnal creatures carrying their slow, deliberate wisdom. Even the wind seemed to whisper, "The world will continue. Things will get messy, then calm. Someone will overpack, someone will disguise themselves poorly, someone will clean up after them, and then it will be tomorrow." Tomorrow, indeed, would bring errands, perhaps bread to deliver, letters to post, and almost certainly a small basket of pastries. Perhaps another wolf, bold or foolish, would choose to impersonate someone's grandmother. But these were not concerns for tonight. Red stretched slightly, letting the day's fatigue settle into her bones. The warmth from the fire and the subtle, familiar aroma of herbs and butter enveloped her. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not triumph exactly, but contentment in the knowledge that for now all was well. The cottage itself seemed to exhale. The curtains swayed faintly in a breeze that carried the smell of rain from somewhere distant. Outside, the forest settled into its nocturnal rhythm. Leaves whispered, branches creaked, and the owls kept their gentle vigil, each sound a metronome of calm reassurance. The narrator, ever vigilant, remarks that endings are rarely dramatic. Most stories close quietly, with a gentle sigh, a flicker of light, and a subtle acknowledgement that yes, life will continue. Crises resolve, misunderstandings fade, and the world, for all its absurdity, remains oddly comforting. Red blew softly on her tea, watched the last flicker of candle flame, and leaned back in her chair. She allowed herself to pause completely, to let the calm of the evening sink in, to enjoy the rare, soft satisfaction of minor survival and shared absurdity. And so the night stretched onward. The candle burned low. The forest whispered its timeless observations. The smell of rain lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the aroma of herbs, firelight, and pastries long consumed. Tomorrow there would be errands. Tomorrow there would be pastries, and perhaps, just perhaps, another wolf would choose to impersonate someone's grandmother. But for now, rest and in. That rest, the world, absurd, chaotic, and slightly ridiculous, was exactly as it should be.